All right, let's dive right in. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack a truly high-stakes constitutional showdown. We're looking at a landmark 1996 judgment from the Constitutional Court of South Africa. It's a case that strikes at the very heart of how any society balances two absolute necessities: keeping us safe from rampant violent crime and protecting innocent people from being wrongly thrown in a prison cell. It's this massive tension that almost every modern democracy faces, and the source material we're exploring today maps out this conflict brilliantly. Let's get into it.
Now, to instantly ground this kind of abstract legal concept, I want you to picture this. If a gun is found on your bus, are you a criminal? You're just commuting to work, reading a book, minding your own business, and suddenly the police pull the bus over. They do a search, and they find an illegal firearm stuffed under a seat right at the back. You have absolutely no idea who it belongs to. But in the eyes of the law, could you literally be considered guilty of illegal possession?
Well, this isn't just some wild thought experiment. This exact scenario was actually presented by Judge Langa in his 1996 Constitutional Court judgment. Listen to this. He noted, if a single firearm were to be found on a crowded bus, each passenger on the bus would be liable to be arrested and prosecuted, and would be presumed guilty unless he or she were able to establish innocence. This hypothetical right here anchors us in the terrifying dilemma we're exploring today. How in the world could an innocent passenger be presumed guilty?
So the crucial piece to understanding this is a legal mechanism that makes this whole thing possible. It's called a reverse onus. Now, normally in a democratic justice system, the state has to prove you committed a crime, right? But a reverse onus, it flips that completely upside down. It shifts the burden of proof right onto you, the accused. You actually have to prove your innocence to avoid prison, rather than the state having to prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
What we're looking at here is a massive clash of two completely different legal standards. In one corner, we have the absolute bedrock principle of justice, the presumption of innocence, where the state has to do the heavy lifting of proving guilt. But in the other corner, we have the reality of a very specific South African law, Section 40, subsection 1 of the 1969 Arms and Ammunition Act. This section utilized that reverse onus we just talked about. It essentially declared that if you were anywhere near an illegal weapon, you were presumed to be possessing it, period, and it was entirely on you to prove otherwise.
Let's just look at how aggressively this law was written. Section 41 stated that any person on, in, or present at premises where an illegal weapon is found is automatically presumed to possess it. And the law defined premises incredibly broadly. We're talking buildings, flats, rooms, offices, vessels, aircraft, or vehicles. This means that simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, like sitting in a taxi, shopping in a store, or just being in a crowded building, automatically made you legally guilty in the eyes of this statute, unless you could somehow, magically, prove you had zero connection to that weapon.
Now, before we rush to judge the lawmakers here, we really have to look at the context. Why on earth would a government enact such an extreme measure? Well, between 1990 and 1994, South Africa was facing some terrifying logistical hurdles against rampant gun violence. Violent crimes involving firearms were just escalating drastically. The country has these massive, extensive borders that were nearly impossible to patrol 24/7. Gun runners were getting incredibly deceptive too. They were using unaware couriers like women and children. They were even hiding weapons in vehicles you'd never suspect, like ambulances and official government cars. And they were doing all of this while the country suffered a severe shortage of trained police personnel.
So the desperation of the state? It was entirely valid. Our source material cites Dr. Lorraine Glanz from the Human Sciences Research Council, who captured the mood of the time perfectly. She observed that the face of crime was becoming increasingly violent and serious, stating, if left unchecked, a protracted increase in violent crime in particular is a threat to social stability. The government wasn't just trying to be oppressive for the fun of it. They were desperately trying to stop a society from completely collapsing under the weight of illegal firearms.
And this brings us right to the state's defense of Section 41. The state's argument was basically that this law was a strictly necessary tool to efficiently separate innocent bystanders from genuine suspects. The logic was actually pretty straightforward. Proving the mental and physical elements of possessing a hidden gun is incredibly difficult for an understaffed police force. So when proving physical possession definitively on the street is nearly impossible, this law forces suspects to provide answers. It acts as a powerful investigative lever.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the unstoppable counterforce that collided with the state's argument, the newly minted South African Constitution, specifically Section 25, subsection 3C. This guarantees that every accused person has the right to a fair trial, which absolutely includes the right to be presumed innocent and to remain silent. You can immediately see the collision course, right?
The Constitution is demanding the state prove guilt, while the 1969 Arms and Ammunition Act is demanding the citizen prove innocence.
And the stakes for getting this balance wrong? They were unbelievably high. If you failed to prove your innocence under Section 41, you weren't just looking at a slap on the wrist. The maximum sentence for the illegal possession of a firearm or ammunition was 25 years in prison. Think about that. Even the minimum sentence of 5 years was often applied. A wrongful conviction under this reverse onus wouldn't just be a huge inconvenience. It would be a catastrophic, life-destroying event for a totally innocent person.
Which brings us to the core conflict of our explainer today. We have two competing values that are both absolutely essential for a functioning democracy. On one side, we have protecting society from violent crime, a very real, incredibly pressing social need. On the other side, protecting citizens from wrongful conviction, the foundational promise of human rights. How does a society balance the immediate, literal danger of armed criminals against the profound tragedy of jailing innocent people?
So, what does this all mean? This is the exact legal mystery Judge Langa and the Constitutional Court had to resolve. Can a law designed to catch criminals survive constitutional scrutiny if it creates a real, tangible risk of convicting the innocent? The court had to decide if the sheer scale of the crime problem justified keeping a law that fundamentally violated a citizen's absolute right to a fair trial. To answer this, the court really dug into how the law actually operated on the ground, and they pointed out its fatal flaw. It essentially encouraged dragnet searches. A dragnet search is a sweeping enforcement action where numerous people are apprehended totally indiscriminately, just hoping to catch a few actual offenders in the net. Because the law presumed everyone in a vehicle or room was guilty, police didn't need to do careful, meticulous detective work to find the actual owner of a gun. They could just arrest everyone present. Let's walk through how this builds into a practical, everyday nightmare for ordinary people. Step 1. You board a crowded taxi. Step 2. The police pull the taxi over at a roadblock and they find a weapon hidden inside. Step 3. Because of Section 41, there is a blanket arrest of all passengers on board. Step 4. You, the ordinary commuter, are now officially accused, and you must legally prove your innocence in a court of law to avoid a potential 25-year prison sentence.
And hey, if you think that sounds kind of far-fetched, consider the very real 1994 Shange case. 8 completely innocent passengers were traveling in a vehicle approaching a police roadblock. Someone in the vehicle threw a firearm and ammunition right out the window. The police arrested all 8 passengers. And because of that reverse onus, despite giving evidence denying any knowledge of the weapon, all 8 of them were convicted at their initial trial. It was only on appeal that their convictions were finally reversed. This proved the law wasn't just some theoretical threat. Innocent people were actively being caught up in this dragnet. The Constitutional Court noted that this law created massive systemic issues by stripping away the fundamental checks and balances of the justice system. It granted unrestrained discretion to police, who could use the threat of the presumption to detain basically anyone. It tempted overworked prosecutors to rely on super easy convictions by just proving the accused was in the room, rather than building an actual, solid case. It essentially shifted the determination of guilt from the careful, controlled environment of the courts directly out onto the streets, and terribly, it forced entirely innocent citizens to bear the massive cost, the stress, and the sheer indignity of a criminal trial.
And so, we reach the turning point, the ruling. Judge Langa and the Constitutional Court determined that while the state's goal of fighting crime was definitely laudable and super urgent, Section 41 went entirely too far. The law failed the constitutional test of being a reasonable and justifiable limitation on human rights. The court stated that a legislative limitation motivated by a strong societal need cannot be disproportionate. Exposing honest citizens to such open-ended jeopardy was simply not justifiable in an open and democratic society.
But importantly, the court wasn't completely blind to the police's struggles. They actually offered an alternative. They suggested that instead of a legal reverse onus that presumed absolute guilt, the state could use an evidentiary burden. Basically, this means the accused might be required to offer a reasonable explanation for why they were near the weapon, helping the investigation along. But crucially, even if they choose to stay silent, the ultimate burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt always remains firmly with the state. The point was, there are less constitutionally damaging ways to fight crime.
This all led to the decisive final order on February 9, 1996. The Constitutional Court officially declared Section 41 of the Arms and Ammunition Act unconstitutional, invalid, and of no force or effect. The court ordered that this invalidity took effect immediately, ensuring that no further innocent people would be subjected to this presumption in any pending trials. The presumption of innocence was fully restored as the supreme law of the land.
Which leaves us with this final, lingering question to consider today. Can a society ever truly trade its fundamental rights for the promise of safety? The South African Constitutional Court decided that no matter how urgent the crisis might be, destroying the presumption of innocence destroys the very justice system you are trying to protect. It's a pretty powerful reminder that the true test of a democracy isn't just how it punishes the guilty, but the absolute lengths it will go to protect the innocent.